Hello, everyone, and welcome to Traffic Corner Tuesday. My name is Paul Kerr, a Client Relationship Manager at SPAC Enterprise, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today, we will be discussing what we learned from a traffic calming experiment. As I've been saying all the way through for the last hour, please join the conversation. Use the chat box. You can use the Q&A. I will be monitoring that and be getting that either during, if it's a prompt, or afterwards on our Q&A session. The Traffic Corner Tuesday web series is brought to you by Mike on Traffic, which is part of the SPAC Enterprise family of companies. Now, SPAC Enterprise consists of a group of traffic engineering companies focused on helping you create healthy transportation systems and fix broken ones. Please visit our websites, countingcars.com or SPAC Consulting, to schedule a call to discuss your transportation equipment and study needs. Now, moving on, today's presenters are Mike Spack and Brian Fiesek. Mike is the creative force and principal writer of the industry-leading blog, Mike on Traffic, and Brian is the vice president of SPAC Enterprise and regularly contributes to Mike on Traffic, as well as co-hosts these webinars with Mike, as you can see. Both Mike and Brian are licensed professional engineers and certified professional traffic operations engineers. My name is Brian. Yep. Now, the core purpose of SPAC Enterprise is to improve transportation globally. And both of these guys take that purpose to heart and are constantly thinking about how our industry can evolve to provide safer and more efficient transportation. Now, today's webinar is about the type of innovation product that they love. So without further ado, gentlemen, please take it away.
Thanks,
right,
Paul.
thanks,
And
Paul.
Since maybe we have faces for radio, we're going to go over to our presentation. But thought we'd like to say hi, and we'll come back in for the Q&A at the end.
All right.
So today's webinar, to set it up a little bit, one of the biggest problems city engineers face is just a fear of change. Whenever anything is proposed new in a neighborhood, you get residents who are concerned, and then that ripples up to the city council members as elected officials. Then they get a little bit of that fear of change. And Deb Heiser and Jack Sullivan at the City of St. Louis Park came up with a creative process here that we're going to go through today. And I think Ben from the City of St. Louis Park is sitting in with us. He had just started on the engineering staff at St. Louis Park when we started this project. So really innovative way to go through a process to calm those fears and help get city council on board and comfortable with some big changes in a neighborhood.
All right. So as Mike let in there, we are in St. Louis Park, which is in Minnesota. So just quick getting our bearings here. Our world headquarters is in Minneapolis. So if I move along here, St. Louis Park, as you can see, is a suburb. And if we scroll on a little bit more into St. Louis Park, you can see standard suburb residential neighborhoods and
Highway 100's a freeway.
Yep.
Then Highway 7 on the north side is an arterial, limited access. And here in the yellow area is the Elmwood neighborhood. And this was scheduled for a complete street reconstruct project, part of the capital improvement plan for the city. And they came in with some concerned residents in the neighborhood. And they had some unique things going on that the city needed to make some changes. And the first controversial thing that drove this, well, before we get to that, let's talk about,
all right.
I'm getting ahead of myself.
All right, so backing up, this is part of the neighborhood. We're kind of in the southeast corner here, and we just wanted to point out a few things that made this unique about the neighborhood. And the first one is over on this side with our arrows, they had a ramp onto Highway 100. So this is a major highway north-south, connects into the area. So you have people coming off the freeway coming in. As most people know, if you're coming right off the ramp, that can lead to higher speeds, can lead to people coming off the freeway. Do they head into the neighborhood? Do they know where they're going? That sort of thing. So it's just, it's an impact to this neighborhood.
And the second thing, which I was getting ahead of myself, but the real starting motivation for this, back the city 25, 30 years ago, did some work in the area and put in the cul-de-sac right by the fire station, and the Webster Avenue on the east side a long time ago was a frontage road, but that was closed. But they inadvertently left a cut-through route open through this Aldersgate United Methodist Church. They left full access for the church, but residents to the tune of about 100 trips a day were using this as a cut-through route to easily get in and out of the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And the third thing, which made them want to use this as a cut-through route, is that Oxford Street is a one-way going eastbound out of the neighborhood, which made it less convenient for residents to get into the neighborhood. So there was that fear of change of you're closing off our shortcut, which we don't want to encourage citizens going on private property. So that was a default decision going in. But then let's look at the neighborhood and do we need to make some changes to help traffic flow smoother? And now being the right time with the full street reconstruct project coming up.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important point too. Try to get ahead of your construction project. You don't want to put something back in and study it after the fact.
Yes. Yep. So timing was great.
All right. So anyway, on to the goals. So as we started looking at this project, what did we want to accomplish with it? So the first one, as Mike just talked about, that cut through the private property. That's clearly an issue if you have a lot of drivers going through a private property, and that's one of the goals is how do we stop that?
Yep. And then two, St. Louis Park is a very well-run city and very high neighborhood and resident engagement in all their processes, and the engineering department and public works department are very committed to running a fully transparent public engagement process with all of their projects. So they wanted to continue that with this project.
Yep. Third one on the list, the 85th percentile speed, they wanted it less than 30. So all the speeds are posted more by statutory 30 mile an hour in the area. We want to make sure those speeds are down. So if we make changes, are we encouraging people to go faster, or are people already faster in the area, and how can we slow them down? So kind of a dual purpose as we look at speeds in the area.
Yep. The next on the list is there are a couple of collector streets in the neighborhood, and it's kind of a unique neighborhood in a pocket between a little bit of an industrial area and a retail area with arterials around it. And there's potential for some trucks cutting through the neighborhood where we wouldn't want them by design.
Right. And then the last one on the list is, can we make sure the average daily traffic, ADTs, stay below 1,000? And so this is a marker we use. It came from a study out west in California that your quality of life for a residential road, the 1,000 vehicles per day is about that limit. So once you go above that, it starts impacting how you view your residential street. So obviously the road can handle more capacity wise, but again, looking at that quality of life, that's the marker we use, is 1,000 vehicles per day.
Yep. So when we're looking at changes in the neighborhood, for instance, converting Oxford Street from a one-way to a two-way,
yes,
we would be changing traffic patterns and volumes would go up on some roads, down on others. We use this 1,000 vehicles per day as a standard. We didn't want to go over with any of these changes.
Yep. So with these goals, as you can see, we had a lot that we wanted to look at, a lot of markers, a lot of good data that we could look at once we got into it. So for this experiment, we went through a process, which we'll detail as we keep going through here. So first thing.
Yeah, step one was Deb called us up and asked if we'd be interested in helping, and we collaborated. Our staff here at SPAC Consulting collaborated with St. Louis Park engineering staff had a couple of talks, a couple of meetings in person to really scope out what could this process look like.
Mm-hmm.
And we also scoped it out in phases, both the scope and the fees in phases to work through one step at a time. So this first phase was preliminary and a pretty small scope of work, because the next couple of steps were, we don't know what we don't know. Right. So first step in the city's process, which I loved, was they had a big neighborhood charrette design type meeting of aerial maps of the whole neighborhood on a lot of tables, and we held it at the fire station right in the neighborhood.
Yeah, get your markers out, tell us what you think,
Mm-hmm.
draw on the maps.
One of our panelists would like a clarification on the 1,000 cars a day is only one every 1.5 minutes. Does that sound about right to you guys in terms of a clarification?
During the
Sure.
a little
but
higher
that's-
during the peaks.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah. I mean, we would expect maybe 100 trips in the peak hour, meaning a couple of cars per minute in the peak hour on a local residential street. So that's
if we
more
translate it down, and then obviously less at night.
Yeah.
and-
almost nothing at 2 a.m.
Yeah.
Um,
All right, so had the neighborhood meeting, very positive experience.
Well, positive for us as the engineering staff
Lots
and the
of ideas.
consultant, but they're going back to what I opened with. We did have a handful of residents who were fearful, had conspiracy theories, had very strong opinions, very vocal and very involved, and frankly,
They're
slowed down
passionate
the-
about where they lived, which
Yes.
is understandable, but
Yes,
not totally unexpected. So I still maintain it was positive
yes.
based on what we
Overall,
got out of it.
overall it was positive. And then the next step coming out of this, we scoped out what are we going to do as the experiment. And step one was to collect existing data on the neighborhood, so we had a benchmark of how things were currently working before we could decide what changes we may want to make.
Right. And so this shows a picture. It's not the full thing. This doesn't show the full neighborhood, but it shows the idea of how much data collection we did. So each of those red numbers there is where we took your basic tube count. So we had tubes out on the road. We collected volumes and speeds and classification. So all those segments, and this was done throughout. We had about it was over 50 segments, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 58 block faces that we
58 blocks.
collected speed classification and directional tube counts on. And then the 4 letters, the A, B, C, D, were intersections in the neighborhood. We decided we needed to do peak hour capacity analysis. And the critical one being out there at Oxford and Wooddale on the east. That was earlier. We had the blue arrow. Oxford Street was a one-way going to the east. And just to the north of that, block faces 18 and 19 are actually private drives going through multifamily housing development. So they allowed us to collect data on those streets, and we were trying to figure out intuitively, and the data bore it out, that since Oxford's one way, people weren't going up to block face 4 to get into the neighborhood westbound. They were using the private 18 and 19.
Going all the way up.
Even though 36th Street, Wooddale, and Alabama were the collectors where we wanted to keep the traffic. So that's the order of magnitude of all of the data we collected. And also independently, while we were doing this, Ben at the City of St. Louis Park went through the crash records to look at all the intersections in the neighborhood to see if there were any trends. We did not find any, but
Still a good exercise to go through and just.
yeah, see if we could find any patterns we needed to correct.
Quick question on that screen. What made you guys decide to collect 1, 9, and 13 given the area?
There were residents over there, and we decided we needed data on every block face, even though, as you would assume intuitively they
So
were
over here.
very low. But that area had some industrial stuff, and we wanted to see if trucks were going over there as well. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left and a lot of material
Yeah, we
to get
should
through.
probably keep
So
going.
let's pick up the pace.
So back to our process. So we gathered the existing data, and then we went through, modeled it, kind of got all the data in hand, looked at what we had, and started coming up with that draft plan. What do we want to change? What do we want it to look like?
So we were thinking we might open up a cul-de-sac. We had 2 different one-way streets we might change. We had to close the Elders Gate cut through. We started looking at the Vizum software program to see if we could use that to model the changes. But after a couple of days of banging our heads against that, decided that was a lot more work than it was worth. So we built a crazy big spreadsheet program, spreadsheet file, and we did a lot of the data changes through that.
So then we had another neighborhood meeting, and this time it was coming back to explain what we did, what we gathered, and what we were proposing.
What we found, where the neighborhood concerns were at, and then what changes we're proposing to make as far as traffic calming, converting Oxford to a one-way. We decided not to convert the other one-way street based on our modeling. So we just laid out the plan.
Basically. Yep. And so this shows, it's a one-pager that was available. I believe it was on the city's website as well, but this shows all the changes we were expecting. And so if we zoom in, we had this nice little key where we showed, I mean, you can see all the different things we were planning there. We had the converting to 2-way on there, traffic circles, curb extensions, traffic control changes. So lots of different things on there.
And to give credit, the city engineering staff developed this graphic that we worked together on what the plan would be, and they put this great plan together, piece of paper together.
So this put some pictures in there so people understood what some of those things were. So as we look, we had this proposed change over here. What would that mean? If it's permanent, that would be like this. Temporary, we're going to put just some barrels in so people go around. And then similarly up here with the center median, showed what it could look like on a permanent basis, but temporarily, this is what we're planning to do. So that gives people a good idea. They know where the changes are and what they might look like as they come into, as they're looking around their block and their routes.
Yep.
And finally, as we go back to the areas we highlighted, you can see over on this side, these, they look like basically red bars here now, but closing this street. So we eliminate that cut through, changing this to 2-way. So now we have opened up the neighborhood. Instead of people coming around, they are now able to come in here. This is changed to an all-way stop. They have the traffic circle here to get back. So we thought about how those routes were, where those people were going, and how we're going to make sure they slow down in the area. So again, just some highlights as we look at this for the plan of what we were doing and how we laid all that out. All right, so back to the process. We explained it at the neighborhood meeting, and now the next step is going forward with the experiment.
Yeah, put in all those barrels and barricades and make the changes on a temporary basis. And then within a couple of weeks, get out there. We went out there and collected all of our data again. We wanted to do a quick check-in to make sure we didn't break anything catastrophically, like all of a sudden shoot 2,000 cars down somebody's streets. We didn't think we would, but we wanted to be sensitive to that. So we did a quick check-in, and then we let it sit for a couple of months running the experiment to let the patterns mature, and also waited for school to get back in session because we wanted to see if things changed from the summertime condition to the school condition. So that first cut was during summer, and the later was when school was in session.
And then we get to the big part of analyzing it. So now we have 3 sets of data.
Yes.
Lots of information, as you can imagine, and we try to pour our way through all of it. And so this is an example of one of the things we put together comparing all those things. So in this case, this sheet is looking at 85th percentile speeds. We have it by the approaches, and then just our phase 1, and then phase 2 was the experiment, round 1, round 2, what the average was, what the change was, and then nicely color coded, as you can see, so we could see where are the areas that had those high 85th percentile speeds. So that'd be above 35 or above, and then the yellow are the 30 to 35. They're in that caution area that they're starting to creep up. And so this allowed us to quickly see the changes for speeds.
Yeah. So as you can imagine, we had thousands of pages of data
Right.
that we tried to condense into a couple of pages of useful graphs. So then we could work with staff to interpret what does all this mean.
And the color coding, doing stuff like this means you don't have to specifically go into the individual numbers. You can quickly see what's changed as you go along. So thinking in that line can really help interpret that data faster. All right, back to our process. So we've analyzed it. Now we have to finalize our plan. So we had the temporary plan. We looked at everything. What does it mean to finalize
Right.
it?
And along with finalizing, of course, we worked closely with city staff. We had several meetings with them. We were sharing draft reports back and forth, but honing in on what mattered and what didn't matter. And the punchline was the big changes as far as converting Oxford Street to a two-way. That was better for the neighborhood. Putting in several traffic circles, kept speeds down. And the punchline is we determined about 3/4 of the changes we proposed and put in on a temporary basis, we decided we should keep and build into the reconstruct plan and make them permanent.
So we finalized our plan, went back to the neighborhood again, had another meeting to talk to them and just lay it out. Basically, this is what we found, these are the results, and this is our final plan moving forward.
Yep, with the engineering staff made a presentation. It also included things like where they're going to cut down trees and add sidewalks. But then we had
That's always important.
We had lots of poster boards around the room, and several of us engineers at different ones to answer resident concerns and talk to them about their specific what's going on in front of their house. As anyone who deals with those kinds of public meetings, it quickly gets very local.
Yes, it does. All right, so after that, then we went back to the city council, talked about it at a meeting there, sought their approval and received it.
Yeah, and this was a pretty hairy, controversial topic when it started. And by going through this respectful process, the council, we had the data on what worked and what didn't and why we were making changes. And it was a very thoughtful and respectful process for the residents. So really the council meeting was a non-event.
Yeah, it was smooth because, just like Mike laid out, all the residents had multiple opportunities for input, and they were talked to throughout the process.
Yes, and very importantly, we listened to them at the beginning of the process, and the plans were designed to address their concerns. Their factual concerns, not their fears, but their concerns of our trucks in front of my street, are people speeding, what are the volumes, the actual measurables. We addressed all those concerns.
So once council approved it, they went into design and then finally getting out there and building it. And basically it's a success story for the city.
Yep, they're just wrapping things up. The streets are built and out there, and just finishing up some landscaping. And yeah, from everything we've heard, it has been a successful project.
All right, so some lessons learned from this whole process, going through everything. Experimenting, it's great for the council, but we could really expand it. It's great for everyone. We mention the council because they're the ones who have to approve it, and by showing them all this data, showing them what would happen, and actually changing our plans based on the data. As we said earlier, the talking with them was a non-event. It was very smooth. They understood everything, and given that the residents had all the opportunity for the input, it just went off without a hitch.
Yeah, and this is a great process for the city engineers and public works directors too. As engineers, we can all come to agreement on our forecasts and analysis, but to actually see what's going to happen, that really made Deb comfortable with the plan and made it very easy for her to present and support. And next, that first charrette at the beginning where we really, I believe, sincerely listened to the neighborhood, built a lot of goodwill with the residents, and we crafted a plan to address their concerns. And they brought up things that we hadn't thought of. So we all come in as engineers and we want to be right, and we go through all this training, but really the people living there, I mean, their experiences, please listen to them, because some of them are going to be crackpots. We've all experienced that. But there are diamonds in the rough there that they're going to bring up stuff we just don't know about because we're not living there every day.
And I think that's an important thing for this one is don't just hold it just to hold it. You actually have to be willing to take into account what's being said and make adjustments to your plan as needed.
Yes.
Third one here, just the barrels, the temporary, it alleviated some of that fear of change because they knew that we could take the barrels away. If something went wrong, we had the opportunity to change it. It just wasn't a permanent change. So that testing really allowed the residents to look at it and say, okay, we can go through a test, and if it sucks, I know it's going to go back to the way it was.
Yeah, and also that us getting out there and quickly collecting data and videos of how things are operating within a couple of weeks to make sure we didn't break something was also very important for the residents to understand this truly was an experiment and we weren't just subjecting them to changes for the sake of subjecting them to changes.
So the experiment, like we said, 75% of it was good and went forward to the final plan, but we found out 25% wasn't needed. It wasn't important to the plan. So
yeah, some of the traffic circles and little bump outs didn't matter. Didn't have any change. So why go through the expense of making changes unnecessarily? And then this is the last one, and this is the first time I've experienced it in kind of these neighborhood meetings. Was the city, because there was some strong vocal residents, they ended up bringing in a third-party facilitator at a couple of the later meetings to kind of enforce the Mr. Rogers rules of let's all be adults and here are the ground rules on how to be respectful, and also enforcing those rules of being civil. That took the pressure off the engineering staff a lot because we're not trained as facilitators.
Well, and we don't have to enforce it either, so it doesn't look like the city's trying to shut somebody down or talk back to them. It's coming from somebody else. They're the ones who are telling you to tone your voice down.
Yeah, so that is one of the huge takeaways of this whole process for me. If you're ever getting into anything that is looking controversial, don't try to run the meeting yourself as the engineer. Bring in a third-party facilitator that's outside of your department, outside of the consulting firm. It was retired city staff who they brought back to facilitate it, but that worked phenomenally well.
All right, so we are bumping right up against our 1 o'clock. We want to first thank everyone for hanging with us through the presentation. And at this point, we will take any of your questions on that. And again, thank you for those who need to leave. We do appreciate you being here. We hope you'll continue to join us on future ones. But for right now, we're willing to keep going through the question and answer as long as there are questions.
So feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions. And also, if you have any interest in this type of project, over at spacconsulting.com, you can click right on the top and schedule a free consult with our team, and we can work through that project with you and see if there's a way we can help you through a similar type of process or project.
All right, so with that, we'll do that. we'll start our video up again
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we'll say hello and
Hello.
then we'll
We have
turn
quite
it
a
over
few
to
questions.
Paul.
today, guys.
I thought there might be,
I'm going to start with one that was asked by several people, which was how long from the team meeting to the council approval?
That took about 9 months. This was about a 9-month process we went through.
At what point in the project did you decide to do the experiment?
That was early on
was
at the
early
team
on.
meeting stage. We came up with that strategy to alleviate the fears in the neighborhood.
Okay. You said you set up a traffic tubes to count the vehicles in the area. How long did it take for you to get the data that way?
That was weeks worth of effort. So setting up each tube counter takes about 15 minutes. So we had almost 60 tube counters for each phase. We also set up video cameras to be able to do turning movement counts for a couple of days. So we could do the capacity analysis and just as importantly, check on the pedestrians and bicycling traffic through those areas. So yeah, it was a heavy data intensive project.
How did you record the data for the 85th percentile? Did you use radar at all? Was it all strictly tubes? That kind of a follow-up to that.
Yeah,
it was tubes. Yeah, it was all tubes in this case.
Okay. What modeling did you use to show traffic?
We started going to the path of Zoom.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, if we think back, that's probably better for larger metropolitan areas. It's just, we were down in the neighborhood, too many links, I mean, it was just a small area that probably wasn't the best fit for that type of software. So in this case, we, like we talked about, we used an Excel file to put all the volumes in and then made our changes as we went through and
So yeah, we changed the distribution patterns kind of manually in the spreadsheets for each scenario as we went through and kind of layered up what would happen if a one-way is converted to a two-way and we close this link. I mean, this is the old-fashioned forecasting method of layering each change and summing up the data.
I think it's important to note though too that we didn't just rely on the forecast because we did gather the data afterward. I mean, at that point our forecasts were immaterial. So the forecast was used to help us create the plan, but then we had the after data to really show us what happened and not just rely on our forecast.
Looking at your proposal, how do residents in the neighborhood access the church parking lot without driving all the way around? And did that increase on-street parking on the local side roads to the south?
As far as
Go back to the map. If we weren't.
Yeah, as far as I know, we didn't collect parking data. That seemed to be a non-issue. And they closed off the driveway on the south end. I'll describe it before Brian can even get to the map.
Yeah.
But basically off the cul-de-sac off Highway 100, that's where almost all the traffic access the neighborhood. And that's kind of regionally for the church, that was not a big deal. So as far as we know, we did not create a traffic problem, and it's also not a very big church on top of it. So just off that cul-de-sac.
Now that I'm finally here. So this is the road that got closed. And then people for the church still had access off of the main collector road.
Yep.
So there's still.
So people to the south would come up Alabama Avenue on the west and go over Oxford Streets. Which are,
again, collector road here, newly two-way road, and then come around and in if they need to.
I just want to give a warning. We still have lots of questions, by the way, and it's a little after, so we'll go as long as we can make it work here. Did you have accident data for the corridor, and were there any of the proposed changes on MSA streets? And what are MnDOT's thoughts on traffic circles on MSA streets, if you know?
Yeah, none of the traffic calming other than striping was on MSA routes, and the MSA route was Alabama Avenue. So all of the traffic calming happened on local city streets. And again, we did look through, Ben at the city sifted through the crash reports, and as in most neighborhoods, crashes are very rare events, so we didn't see any patterns.
Yeah, no trends or patterns, nothing really. And then just For those not in Minnesota, MSA routes are very similar to collectors. They are designated truck routes, which is why MnDOT, our state DOT, gets or has some jurisdiction over it. And yeah, they wouldn't want traffic circles in there basically because they are designed for trucks. They want the trucks in those routes. So my initial thought on that is if you're trying to propose a traffic circle for an MSA route, it's not going to go through.
Certainly a challenge.
How often did the temporary barrels and tubes need to be fixed from being moved or changed by drivers or residents during the temporary data collection?
Yeah, very good point. As far as we know, it wasn't that much because of the residents, but we did find a couple of the traffic circles kind of needed to be adjusted based on traffic patterns that kind of changed the shape of them a little bit as we went out there and watched and observed. So kind of that helped the designers at the city think about
the size basically and how people are coming around. But yeah, with the lower speeds, I mean, we weren't talking about a freeway or highway or anything. I think that helped people as well. It's it didn't run into things, I guess I'll put it that way.
What role did winter maintenance play in considering changes? For example, are there concerns about having the traffic circles in the middle of the road when snow removal was needed?
No, the city's committed to making that happen. The experiment was in kind of fall, summer, spring time, so we didn't deal with snow, but they're committed, and that was discussed. Would they be okay plowing these types of treatments? And the public works staff and engineering came to the agreement they were okay with it.
What was the 25% of the experiment that you found wasn't needed?
We added some traffic calming in the western part of the neighborhood, concerned about a little bit of the truck traffic that might be over there. And there wasn't much truck traffic, and we decided some of those traffic circles and bump out type treatments didn't have an effect. But they were kind of added into the process of the data didn't show big problems, but hey, maybe we can make some improvements, but then the after data didn't show much improvement either.
Were there any neighborhood concerns regarding the parking that you know of?
Down on the southern part, there's a busy restaurant, and we took that into account of not making significant changes down there, but we did not do a full parking study. We kind of anecdotally knew that on the weekends it's busy with parking and
in that particular area.
Yep. So just the decision was kind of leave it alone and make sure that same amount of parking could be accommodated.
Just a time reminder, it is 1:08, and I have several more questions.
Great. Keep them coming.
Yeah, keep them coming.
Who funded the project, and was there any issues associated with the funding or finding the source for the funding for the project?
It's my understanding that came from general city funds. So just part of the general engineering budget for the overall neighborhood reconstruct project. The city had the funds available and were able to make it happen.
Yeah, city funding. So they budgeted for it. They knew they were going to go through a process, and then through our work as well with our step-by-step proposal, we were able to really hone in rather than give them a big budget that with a lot of unknowns at the beginning. We tried to make sure we gave them very good numbers as we went through.
Yeah, and as we showed you the graphic of the changes and the city put that together, those are some of the cost-saving measures of what can city staff do, the crash analysis they kept. So it wasn't a turnkey consultant project. It was more like we were part of their embedded team helping them out.
Yeah, very much a collaboration.
Yep.
Do you have any insight on how this process works with DOTs?
I assume you're talking state DOTs, and every jurisdiction is going to be different on how open they are to experimenting, what kind of measures they'll allow on different levels of streets. But now that data collection is getting cheaper and cheaper, and we have these methods of experimenting, we're hopeful. We're kind of planting a seed that we can nurture here to do more of this kind of work.
And we've worked a little bit with counties around here on different experiments, running some small things. So it's working its way up, I guess. We haven't worked with big experiments with the state yet.
Yeah, although we've talked about some of our, MnDOT has been coming to us for kind of data heavy experiment type projects, or at least unearthing data like what's the capacity at some of our roundabouts in the state, be it those upper saturation levels. We're doing kind of a study on wrong way treatments right now with MnDOT. So they're looking at trying stuff out, collecting data and figuring out if things are working or not. So at least here in Minnesota, there seems to be the appetite for doing more of these kinds of experiments.
Okay. Have you guys ever used a neighborhood voting scheme for traffic calming on local roads? And do you ever use traffic calming on collector roads?
So a voting scheme, some cities in this area, in Wisconsin too, they actually have that as part of their ordinances, that a certain percentage, whether it's 50 or 60% of the residents have to agree for the traffic calming to be put in. We haven't used it, I guess, as an independent part without those ordinances in there. So it usually comes from the city or the town itself. Not from the consultant imposing it.
Yeah, what was the second part of that?
The second part was
calming on collectors.
Yes.
That's a policy decision, and
you need to be very careful about it, in my opinion. That's where you expect trucks. That's where you want that truck traffic to be. So if you're putting any traffic calming in there, what does it mean for trucks? And do you have the potential for the unintended consequence of sending those trucks into residential areas because they don't want to be on the collector anymore?
yeah, and are you upsetting kind of the residents in there who are then going to speed in the grid network because of the traffic calming out on the collector? So again, that's why we love this type of experiment, is to make sure you don't have those unintended consequences. So I would tread lightly into looking at a collector, but if you're going to do the collector, collecting before after data on the collector as well as the surrounding neighborhood to make sure you're not breaking anything, I would go that route.
Okay. It looked like some of the speeds increased during the experiment phase. Which methods caused that? And were those put in permanently?
That was just the change in the network.
Mainly as people went to different routes, they might have had a longer route. I think it was more a reflection of where the volume went. And as you had more volume, the speeds tended to creep up a little bit. There weren't any, as I'm remembering, there weren't any huge changes. I mean, we're talking about 3, 4, 5 miles an hour. So it wasn't like something jumped from 25 to 40. We didn't have any changes like that, but we did have some that went from 33 to 35 or something like that. So it really depends on the context as we looked at. As we looked at it, we tried to put it in that context. But what was it before? What's the magnitude of change? And what does our plan reflect as we look at it?
Yep, and that was all accounted for as we went and talked through the final results and what are we going to do for those permanent changes.
Okay. What do you do for temporary bump outs?
In this case, we just use pylons to kind of create that circle. We've been involved with other projects where they've put big planters, and there's different ways you can do that, but you're just trying to create the shape of what it'll be after.
You're just trying to put an implement on the side, basically.
There's several questions asking this, so I'm just going to kind of combine them. What was the total cost of the project and a study of this magnitude?
Order of magnitude, it was under $50,000
for our work.
For all of our work.
For all of our work. That's not what the city put into it, obviously, because their staff did stuff. So it was some of their time as well. I don't know what the design and construction was. That's a whole different matter.
Yes.
We still got a lot of questions. We're coming up on 1:15. Just for a time check for those of you that need to get back or do anything.
Yep. Let's keep going.
How do you address any neighborhood concerns unearthed during the workshop sessions that couldn't be solved with the 3/4 change?
We were upfront about them, of here's what we
basically.
can do and what we can't do. And some of the big changes in the neighborhood where they're adding more sidewalks, and because of sidewalks, they ended up losing a couple of trees. And I mean, all of these changes are compromises, and we didn't hide behind any of the issues. We did the best we could. But no, there are going to be situations that just can't be fixed, at least to the satisfaction of the residents.
Was city council by district or at large? In other words, was there a specific council member you were working with or multiple ones?
Our work was with the engineering staff, and they worked with the city council members, and St. Louis Park is broken up into district representatives plus a couple of at-large seats. So they have both. And it was staff who kind of the liaisons with the council members.
Why a traffic circle and not speed bumps?
That going back to snow plowing, the city doesn't really want to be in the speed hump game here with snow plowing.
Has there been data collection after the permanent installation? If so, what were those results?
No.
Permanent just got put in this year, so
Yeah, no.
there hasn't been a big opportunity for it, but I don't know that they're going back there. They haven't contacted us about it at this point. Maybe in the future, but not right now.
Yep.
So and then another question regarding about what you use. So they're saying computer aided program. The only one that you used was spreadsheets. Was there anything else that you used?
We use Bistro to do intersection capacity analysis.
Someone noticed the all-way stop intersections proposed or implemented as a traffic calming measure. Did engineers confirm that multi-way stop warrants were met? If not, explain the criteria you used to justify the establishment of the all-way stops.
There were several all-way stops in the neighborhood already, and where we proposed them, we did go through warrant analysis.
Yeah, where we proposed them was where we expected and then where we saw volume changes that made them warranted. So it wasn't like we put them in specifically for calming. We had reasons behind it.
Although historically, St. Louis Park has used some basket weave stop signs in the past for what they feel is traffic calming, and we have a slight disagreement of opinion. We're much more the warranted stop sign kind of guys. Absolutely.
Were there additional change orders or additional fee requests as the project progressed?
No, because we did it step by step. I think we had 3 different proposals on it that we didn't propose the whole project. We took it phase by phase.
Yeah, that allowed us to really hone in on the details of what was needed and really get our feet where we needed it without any unknowns.
Did you incorporate any intersection lighting into the temporary or permanent traffic circle installations?
All of the intersections do have some street lighting out there. So no, we didn't go in and put in more lighting for the temporary measures. And street lighting was part of the final neighborhood design, I believe.
Did you collect pedestrian crossing information, and how did this play into your study if you did?
In certain locations, yes. And it was just one more factor. I mean, it's just something that we looked at as we considered any of our changes, particularly the bump outs as we looked at those. We're a big fan of reducing the crossing distance where it makes sense.
Yeah, so we always get pedestrian and bicycling volume when we do an intersection turning movement count. Mm-hmm. So we scrutinize that data. And in the neighborhood, there's good facilities out there, but the volumes weren't that high.
More or less, what is a realistic budget for a study of this, such as this? Is another question.
Okay.
Well, it's completely depends on the size of your network and what you're looking at. So it's
I
don't know how to do an apples to apples comparison on that one.
Agree with that. And do you guys consider a road diet?
We didn't have any 4-lane roads out there, but we did skinny up Alabama Avenue, the collector, as part of the project. That's with bike facilities, that's out there. And then kind of with the bump out. So we were making things narrower, but there were no 4-lane roads to make 3 or 2 lanes, if that's what you mean by a road diet.
We like road diets, so I would encourage other people to look at them where they do have those 4-lane undivided roads.
Was there any issues brought up to you guys regarding the residents being confused by the barrels for the traffic circle?
No, although our data collection guys did have a lot of contact with the residents while they were out there. So there was a lot of communication, and that definitely slowed them down, but they were respectful and listened through the process.
And last question, I'd save this one for the end. Do you work in Pennsylvania?
That's an interesting question. We've worked around the country now. Our practice is expanding. Obviously, if we can do stuff remotely and if we can partner with you, we would love that opportunity. For us to fly out there for half a dozen meetings, obviously that has costs associated with it. So that kind of gets into your budgeting. We do have projects around the country now where we do fly out. So we are expanding, and it's kind of project by project or collaborative, and it's got to work for your budget.
Yeah, it's within the realm of possibilities, but it's going to depend on the specifics of the project and like Mike said, what your budget is.
And always the last question, is there going to be a replay of this if they missed some of it because they were in a meeting?
Yes. Yes, you should get an email follow-up with this, and we have a YouTube channel we post all of our webinars at. And for those who've noticed, Mike on Traffic, as well as our other websites, are going through a refresh, and kind of early next year, hopefully we're rolling out an expanded version of Mike on Traffic with a lot easier navigation of our different resources and videos, and maybe even building out kind of a forum so we can share some of our experience and go back and forth and kind of create more of a community. So stay tuned for changes over at Mike on Traffic.
All right. Yeah, we'll stop it there. We'll do anything else by email.
Okay.
All right.
And then one last thing, if you're hanging on here,